It's the 1920s, and the Ford Motor Company is booming. Edsel Ford, who is Henry Ford's son, is the president in charge of the Rouge River complex in Dearborn, Michigan. But the real man behind operations is Harry Bennett, a diminutive but aggressive enforcer. His security department, made up of current and former bootleggers and crooks, uses violence to keep people in check. And on the eve of the Great Depression in 1928, Henry Ford decides that he wants to control more of the supply chain and decides to establish a rubber plantation in Brazil called Fordlandia. So to all appearances, the Ford Motor Company is doing very well. Henry Ford claims that the failing stock market has had no impact on his company. But beneath the surface, things are unraveling. The laborers, many of whom are immigrants, Jews, or African Americans, are struggling to keep their jobs, and those who do continue to work are facing lots of cost-cutting measures, having to work harder for the same amount of pay. And when Harry Bennett hears that labor wants to organize, he will use everything in his power to stop them. While many books have been written about Henry Ford and his production plants, the 2026 historical novel by John Sayles, Crucible, focuses on the laborers, to whom the Fords owe their fortune. This is a polyphonic novel in which we follow a large cast of characters, working in different divisions of the company, both in Dearborn and in Brazil. Joe Rogan, who used to run the sawmill in Dearborn, is sent along with his family to Brazil to help establish the plantation. He hires some Brazilian workers, one of whom is Joao, and his son Flavio becomes friends with Carrie, who is Joe's daughter. In Dearborn, Michigan, we follow Kaz, a Polish immigrant, who is struggling to maintain employment while taking care of 3 children, a set of twins, as well as a daughter with cerebral palsy. Brilliant, but unfortunately prejudices of the time make it so that she struggles to be heard and to be respected. We also follow Rosa, a Jewish American who really believes in the union and decides to help them convince the laborers that they need to go on strike. And finally, we have Ezekiel Crowder, also known as Zeke, who loves boxing, and he works in what is arguably the most dangerous part of the plant, and that is the foundry, where he pours molten metal. He is African American, and the Ford Motor Company was one of the few companies in Michigan that hired Black people and actually paid them decently. Even so, his work is very hazardous. He and many of his Black co-workers are suspicious about the unions, and this is something that Harry Bennett, the enforcer, profits from. This is because the unions historically excluded Black people. Also, they're getting paid more than other companies pay Black people. And for many of the laborers who came from the South, despite how hazardous the working conditions of the Ford plant, they're still an improvement over what they faced in the South. While some Goodreads reviewers find the large cast of characters and the multiple POVs to be overwhelming, I actually didn't have much trouble following it, except when Harry Bennett is talking to his goons, because of course he's not going to speak very transparently about his motivations. So you're following essentially a mob boss who has control over the police and the bootleggers, and he does them favors and then they owe him, and that's who basically comprises his security department. That part was hard to follow, but otherwise I actually didn't find it too overwhelming. And the way that it's written, I think, really lends itself to film, which I think is the point, because John Sayles is an award-winning screenwriter, and I feel like the way that he wrote the book is to kind of set the story up for potentially a film adaptation in the future, which I would love to watch. And the multiple strands of the narrative come together in the end like a tapestry. Or perhaps a better analogy would be the Detroit industry murals, which were painted by Mexican artist Diego Rivera in the early 1930s, and which are described in detail in this novel and center the laborers. In many ways, Crucible reflects those murals. I would highly recommend Googling things, searching things on YouTube. There are cartoons that are described, and these are the wackiest cartoons. They're contemporary cartoons, and it's definitely worth watching those cartoons after you've read their description. If you like ambitious, sprawling novels that focus on ordinary people who are often overlooked, this is definitely the novel for you. It really captured the social and political experiences of the everyman who worked at the Ford plants. I will say my favorite parts of the book were about Fordlandia. I didn't even know about this plantation in Brazil, and it makes me want to actually read Greg Grandin's nonfiction history of Fordlandia, which John Sayles does say inspired his book, at least in those sections. I also thought that Sayles did a pretty good job at capturing the controversies surrounding the unions and the ways in which race played a role, but also how Harry Bennett profited from the racial conflicts. My only criticism has to do with the proofreading. My most recent short was about the lack of proofreading in this book. There are quite a few typos. And since finishing Crucible, I actually read another book that had even more typos. So I guess in comparison, this wasn't too bad. But it's just so annoying to me that publishers are just cutting costs by probably not even hiring proofreaders. Or if they do, they're not hiring in-house. They're basically hiring contractors who are probably overworked and underpaid. And anyway, it is so frustrating because this is not John Sayles' fault, but I just found the typos to be a little bit too distracting, even though I feel like I'm the only person who noticed this because I don't see any reviewers mention it. So it didn't ultimately take away from the book. I'm still giving the book 4 stars. And I guess that's the frustrating part because on the one hand, the story is so good and, I want to rate it highly, and I do. But then publishers see that and are like, oh, good, people like this. So we'll just continue producing subpar writing, which is infuriating. Anyway, that's Crucible by John Sayles. If you like historical novels, if you're interested in the history of the Rust Belt, if you're wanting to understand the people's Tycoon, but from the perspective of the people, definitely recommend this book. I didn't find it boring at all. And I hope to read more by Sayles. Thank you everybody for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.